think we'll get started again, and I'd like to invite Emma Sheehan to come up to the stage and talk to us about the Lyme Bay MPA, with which she has been involved with for many years. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Sam. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So oh, that's not working. How shall I move this on? Oh, hello. Oh, okay.
That's forward, that's reverse.
Okay, got it. Sorry. So I'm from the University of Plymouth, where I lead a research group who study marine protected areas, fisheries management, and also offshore installations that have the potential to act as de facto MPAs by providing structure and excluding bottom-toed fishing. So our real ethos is to use non-destructive, cost-effective methods using local fishermen, deploying videos on lots of different types of arrays and using acoustic telemetry to monitor the marine environment. So before I jump into Lyme Bay, the topic of my talk, I just want to highlight a brand new paper that's just come out, just in time for this symposium, that is highlighting the emergency themes for marine biodiversity conservation, management and policy. So there is lots of the co-authors are in this room, and it's really encouraging to hear that lots of these themes are already in progress. So if anyone with a keen eye who does know Lyme Bay in this room might have spotted, that is me on board Miss Patty, animated. And there's copies of this paper out in the lobby that you can help yourself to. So I'll just quickly run through these 4 emerging themes. One is the whole site approach that I'm going to talk more about, and so will Jean-Luc. Ecosystem-based fisheries management, the need to integrate fisheries and conservation legislation and management, the need to develop world-class socioeconomic and ecological monitoring with subset sentinel sites studied well, including reference sites, has already been mentioned today, and integrating MPAs into the wider seascape as critical functional components with other effective area conservation measures, like offshore mussel farms and offshore wind and wave. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Lyme Bay, what you need to know is there are 2 stars of the show, pink sea fan and the king scallop. So this one's protected and this one's the desirable one, whose fishing techniques are not commensurate with protection of pink sea fan and similar reef-associated species. So after years of campaigning, which I had nothing to do with, Lyme Bay finally received statutory protection from 200 square kilometres, which is indicated, I'm not going to point, that black box. So since this was designated in 2008, Lyme Bay has also received other levels of protection from IFCA bylaws, from a special area of conservation, and also in 2011 the Blue Marine Foundation got involved to develop voluntary code of conduct with the fishermen who fish inside this area. So it's a place where you can't do any bottom-toed fishing, but you can still set pots and nets and scallop dive. This one is key because it is using the whole site approach. We didn't know that's what it was called then, but we now know this is a whole site approach rather than feature-based management. So everything inside that box receives the same level of protection. So right on day 1 of protection, we started monitoring the reefs using this flying toad array and baited video to make sure we were trying to capture the whole of the ecosystem. We have sites right across the box, it's how it's known locally, and then in sites in areas that were previously closed under voluntary agreements and in sites that are still open to fishing. We were given a pre-selected suite of indicator species, and this, if it works, here we go. So this is the videos that we record. Now, at the moment you're looking at wrasse chasing lasers, and we've used this behaviour to also try and measure territory size for wrasse, but how we would use this video is count all the large and rare species, and then we cut it up into frame grabs to enumerate the common and encrusting species. So to the data. There's so many ways of exploring this data, but I'm just going to focus on NTAXA, so total diversity. And in the first 3 years, it was very, very slow to react, and we were kind of thinking, why have they protected this area? It's not very impressive. But in 2011, the whole bay really erupted, and we started seeing really impressive levels of biodiversity. And by 2013, we had 50% more species then compared to when we started in 2008. So this brings me to our first lesson that we learned, which is related to the whole site approach. And it wasn't just the reef-associated species weren't just recovering on the rocky reefs, but they were also recovering on the sediments in between the reefs. And this has been absolutely crucial because if there's been a feature-based approach, we would never have seen this or learned that these species could even exist on these sediments. So while fishing was keeping these sediments mobile, by removing fishing, they were then becoming consolidated and supporting reef-associated species. So this is much better put than I can do right now in the Marine Protected Areas book, chapter 9. Okay, so 2013 was the peak, and this was because of the storms that were to hit the southwest over the winter of 2013-2014. And these were enormous, like off the scale. This is when we lost the railway, Plymouth lost pubs and restaurants. These were really like storms, consecutive storms off the charts. And I'm going to focus on one site in particular so you can see the change. This is Site 56 in the southeast corner of the box. The seabed was covered in fluff and sea fans were looking good. Ross coral was flourishing. And then this is what it looked like after the storms. It's basically like loads of sand had just been thrown at the MPA and had really hit brittle species like Ross corals that had basically disappeared overnight and was left lots of scallops, clean and open. Not to mention really given the pink sea fans a good going over. So this is what it looked like in the numbers. The storms reduced the diversity down to 94% of the 2008 levels in the MPA and in areas that were still open to fishing. Here you've got diversity on top, and I've also included abundance, but they're following the similar trends. And again, this is the same site in 2016, and this just shows that even though the storms really hit the area, what we're seeing is what appears to be a much quicker bounce back from these effects than we'd seen from bottom-toed fishing. So bearing this in mind, our paper that we're writing now will also include an assessment of all the MPAs that might have similar habitats and similar wave exposure to Lyme so that we can start paying attention to this. So I just want to highlight that we have looked at all the different species, and while many followed this trend that we've seen, some really don't. Things like gobies and scavenging species such as sea stars, they don't seem to change their abundance depending on whether they're inside or outside the protected areas or after storms. And some work that we did with Sussex IFCA a while ago now helped us to understand why this might be. Because we observed sea stars lifting off the seabed during storms and high currents and then bouncing along with the tide so that they can relocate, perhaps to find new foraging grounds or something we do with mating. And certainly might explain why we see these species mass strand. So the next thing I just want to highlight is the importance of regular monitoring. There's a paper out there that claims to also be done a 10-year study of Lyme Bay. And if you just take 2 points, which they've done, and try to assess species trajectories, you might miss out on all of this information and really underrepresent the potential for marine protected areas to deliver conservation and fisheries work. So, just to highlight, this work has been hell to fund. You know, DEFRA did commission the first study, which Natural England helped enormously every year, but you know, these were, every year we had to find new and different ways of funding this. The European Commission have picked up the last 3 years across 2 different projects, and now we're going into the UN Decade of Ocean Science. I literally have no idea how we're going to carry on funding this, and I really, if anyone's got any ideas about how to fund this summer, I'd love to hear it, because I don't want 2020 to be the year we drop the ball. So I'm sure my time's ticking away very quickly, so I just want to highlight the other work that we've been doing in Lyme Bay. So I've already said that we use baited video, and we've been coupling the baited video with acoustic sensors so that we can try and see if we can listen to diversity changes as a means of having a more efficient way of monitoring all the other MPAs out there. So I don't have time to go into this. We've also had a huge potting experiment with Blue Moon Foundation and DEFRA. The report is now available where we're looking at potting density. And it does seem that there's an optimum potting density to deliver conservation and fisheries benefits.
Emma, you've got a little bit more time than you thought you had, so.
Oh, cool. Okay, brilliant. And then also with Devon and Severnifka, we'd worked with a potting experiment where we attached GoPros to pots. So the very direct impact of hauling pots we've enumerated. And that's in review, which we're just currently getting through at the moment. Another piece of work we've been doing just to the west of the MPA is the UK's first large-scale offshore mussel farm. And here we're trying to capture the whole of the ecosystem reaction to the mussel farm. And the most important things is the mussel farm, by dropping clumps of mussels to the seabed, appears to be restoring what was very, very degraded habitat. So these papers will be coming. We've had a PhD student who's just about to finish up this work, and another one now who's just starting, who will also look at the oceanographic interactions. One paper that is out is Pelagicam. So this is a method that we've developed to understand the fish aggregation effect of the mussel farm. And by deploying these little Pelagicams, we can enumerate these thousands of horse mackerel that are flying across the ropes. So we've also tried to employ a bit of artificial intelligence to help us do this, which is in the paper if you're interested. So the scientific papers are coming, but a summary of the positive effects we've seen so far is available in the Food Science and Technology Journal. And I just now want to run through the key lessons. So, the emerging theme 1 from the paper was the whole site approach. Number 2 is mobile and sessile organisms move within and between seabed features, requiring a holistic approach to ecosystem-based management. To assess levels of human impact, we need examples of long-term monitoring with highly protected reference sites, and offshore blue industries have the potential to restore seabed habitats. So climate change is increasing storm frequency and magnitude, which clearly requires resilient seabed ecosystems to withstand them. And potting can be managed at appropriate densities, but it's certainly not benign. So just moving forward, where we're going next with this work is using acoustic telemetry and isotopes. We want to assess the value of the mussel farm to the local fisheries. So we're using these tags to tag lobsters and crab and sea bass to understand whether they're going out whether they're spilling over into neighbouring fishing grounds in the MPA. And I had a bit of a highlight because we had a bit of a dispensation issue, but over the lunch I caught up with DEFRA, and apparently it's going to be in hand. So I'm really pleased because this work delivers amazing results, and this is just some of the work we did looking at sea bass.
2 minutes, Emma.
Trying to measure the effect of bass nursery areas. And each one of these flying dots is a sea bass that we've now tracked over nearly 2 years and is yielding really, really amazing results. That work was presented to DEFRA quite recently, but is certainly another talk in itself. So I have brought with me some highlights from Baited Video 2019, because we don't have the video yet, the data yet. But I just want to thank these people, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you to Emma for running through what is a very long-term and very complex piece of work in a very short space of time, so well done for doing that. I think some interesting themes there, particularly about the value of long-term monitoring and about the funding for long-term monitoring in order that you can really understand these sites. I've got time for a couple of questions. Does anybody would like to ask? And there in the corner. The reason for not saying about people's names is both John and I have completely forgotten everybody's names, despite knowing all of you very well. So this was our way of trying to get around that problem.
Speak for yourself. With me, it's age, Sam. It's not. Anyway, look, Emma, you mentioned, I think you said something like bivalve aquaculture was enhancing biodiversity on the seabed. Was it mussels, perhaps?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. The door just started opening.
I think you said that mussel deployment on the seabed enhanced biodiversity, and there was a paper, I think you flashed up in a journal. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is a mussel farm which is just deploying long line ropes in an area that had been previously trawled for many, many years. And so the farm doesn't introduce anything other than rope. And so the mussels are the spat settles naturally. And as a result of just some of the clumps don't grow homogeneously, and also through fishing, mussel clumps end up on the seabed. If you look at the old fisher maps, this area would have been colonised by mussel beds and oyster reefs. So I would argue that this action is restoring seabed habitats, and now we're seeing how beneficial it is to species of commercial and conservation importance.
And you're actually measuring the seabed diversity?
Yeah, we're using ROVs, towed video, baited video, mid-water. We're doing plankton, we're counting the birds and the mammals. I think, what else are we doing? There's one more. Anyway, we've got it covered, yeah. And we've been doing this in a very, with a proper survey design where we've got sites within the mussel farm and at control areas, and we've been using a standardised approach for every year since 2013.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Emma? Thank you.
Peter Jones from University College London. I think one of the fascinating things about the Lyme Bay case study, as well as the value of having this really thorough economic and ecological and social data set, is it indicates that it was as much the large whole site approach that delivered the benefits as it was the no-take areas. So just reflecting on that and thinking about the current consultation on highly protected marine areas, I wonder whether we should be having a conversation about both HPMAs and taking a whole site approach. And if somebody said you can have one or the other, I personally would be inclined to go more for the whole site approach as being a way forward.
Yeah, and the whole site approach is mentioned in the government's 25-year environmental plan, so that we were really enthused to see that. I think from an experimental ecologist point of view, I would love to have some proper controls where we know what we're aspiring to, what we're recovering to. But certainly, if I was being pragmatic, just protect things appropriately and properly, I would advocate for sure, yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? One more question for Emma? Lady at the back there on the left-hand side. Thank you.
A curiosity question. How far did the damage, what depth did you see the damage to the seabed during the storms?
Our sites go from about 22 metres to 30 metres, and the deepest being 30, and those were probably the ones that were most exposed. So I think what's happening with the storms is that even though we've got a marine protected area, it's still a young site, and but just outside it's still quite heavily trawled, and so all those sediments are still loose and unconsolidated. So the edges of the MPA probably were the worst hit by the sediments moving into the protected area. So I think this is one of our other issues with just having these like small MPAs, is that we still, under climate change scenario where we're going to get stormier, we've still got this risk when the storms come that the MPAs aren't going to be able to withstand those impacts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Emma, for that. That's
Thanks,
great.
Em.